Welcome to another episode of TPM Ridge, the podcast where we bring in industry leaders in technical program management to share their insights, experiences, and the lessons they've learned on the front lines of the TPM movement. I'm your host, Doran Katz, and each week we dive in deep into the methodologies, mindsets, and tools that will empower you to drive excellence in technical program management. Whether you're new to TPM or looking to take your skills to the next level, this podcast is your go-to resource for transforming TPM principles into real-world success. Welcome, everyone, to our post-summer or fall episode of TPM Ridge. It's been a little bit of a break. We've all taken some time off to recharge our batteries, and we're back here. And today's topic is going to be really interesting. We're going to be talking about fractional TPMing. You know, we've sort of heard of fractional sort of executive work and, things like that sort of been gaining momentum. But, basically it's essentially it's a part-time contract-based role where you kind of split your time across multiple teams, products, and even companies. So it's sort of like WeWork of program management, as somebody quipped once. So this is it's becoming a interesting space where startups and even larger firms are trying to do more with less. So without having to pay for a full-time headcount, especially these days with AI and all of that stuff that's happening, this is sort of a new sort of gig economy style flex work. So it's a great topic to discuss. With me, I've got Michael Getz and James Dehoff. Welcome, guys.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks, Doran.
Yeah, happy to be here. Back to school, as my kid would say.
Yes, I don't know when, it's interesting. In different parts of the country, people start different times. So for me, my kids started last week. I don't know, James, in Texas, when do you guys start?
Yeah.
I think a bit earlier, right?
Yeah, two out of my three kids are in school. They started 2 weeks ago, and it has changed the home dynamic.
Yeah. In New York, we started this week, so all good.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the colder climate places start later, I think, because it has to do with the Christmas, winter, snow closures and stuff like that. I'm guessing. I don't know. But anyway, back to topic here. So fractional has been a really interesting topic because Michael, you posted up an interesting stat where here in the US, 25% of companies, maybe up to 35%, are currently utilizing fractional executives, which is I'm really surprised by that number, and it'll probably end up going up a bit more. And it's mostly been around CFOs, CMOs, and CTOs, but we're starting to see some project management folks, sort of come. So what do you guys think about this trend, and what are you guys seeing in your insights?
Yeah, I was looking up the number, and then I think even interesting, like on one of our favorite websites, LinkedIn, we saw also that the term or the search term fractional also soared from 2,000 to like 140,000 from 2022 and 2024. And the question is it like also COVID related? One thing that what we also should discuss in the course of that is what does fractional even mean for impact, and is it really a trend or is it a necessity in the first step? And maybe James, you have a first stance on what it means TPM working as fractional TPMs or in a fractional role.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept because a lot of TPMs, when they thrive in organizations, it's because they know how to navigate complex organizational hierarchies, and they can get things moving really quickly, right? So working in a fractional capacity, I think it would look a lot like there's a very specific problem that the company would need to be solved, right? This isn't a general TPM that knows program management. This would be a TPM. This fractional TPM would really be of value when they know a really specific domain and are able to add value in that very, very niche area. And so that's one way, I think the most common way I could imagine seeing a fractional TPM be deployed and used effectively. That'd be part-time commitment on behalf of that TPM to share that niche expertise.
Do you see that as sort of similar to a contract, just a general contract role where you kind of come in with a specialized set of skills for that specific domain and purpose. Only this is sort of where you're split across different companies and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I
it
can.
just, yeah.
When you talk about skills, I think if we put ourselves in being in fractional TPM, so let's forget at the moment about our corporate job and say like you're starting on Monday as fractional TPM for a company. You arrive there and you lose one, and we talked last year on the summit as well a lot about like impact and a lot about like influencing without authority. Which skills would I fear a little bit? A fractional TPM would excel where TPMs who are deeply in the organization, as James said, are embedded into it and you build relationship, have trust. But it's just like you are arriving. And which skill set are you leaving behind or need to leave behind? Or can never excel in because you don't have an opportunity because you are perceived as, and I would throw like two very provocative words into it, like as outsider, or even are you hired as firefighter? And I mean, this would be one thing. And I think like the biggest thing that you lose is literally the influence without authority. And as in Fraction TPM, doing it longer as a third point, I think it can become mentally quite cumbersome to always build new relationships, like never having a steady state, but always like going into an organization and never know what to expect.
It's interesting. Yeah. So I guess when you compare it to other roles that, do fractional, like, like CFOs and other executive roles, they come in with authority, obviously. So it's not a matter of earning the trust, but you sort of have that authority, that mandate, which is interesting. But on the flip side, you have engineers who also come in, sort of fractionally, and for them, it's probably been harder to do context switching. I would say they're not working towards earning authority either, so they maybe, I presume, would lack that motivation. So I don't know what your thoughts are on there's different role comparisons, for TPMs versus others.
Yeah, I would think that like with the TPM specifically being fractional, I have a hard time with that, thinking about an IC TPM being fractional. To me, that sounds like a contract project manager that can dedicate time to a smaller project. If there are truly strategically important things that a company needs to deliver on, I don't think they're very incentivized to have a fractional non-member of the company jump into that. And so the way my mind kind of thinks about it is like, okay, let's consider maybe the size of the companies, right? If you look at startups and small companies, they may lean into that. They may lean into a fractional TPM, but what also may happen is that somebody else with a different role in the company may become that fractional TPM by doing those activities that a TPM would do to get things across the finish line. Because in startups, outcomes trump everything else, right?
Yeah.
And the gray area of roles is a lot higher than when you get to the scale of like Google, where role definition is very, very strict and there's a lot less flexibility within a role to do different types of things. So I think if you look at company size startups, a fractional TPM might just be somebody informally doing it internally. Or yes, there may be like the company might not exist in 3 months if we don't get somebody in here to drive this thing forward and help us get organized, right? So it would be like what you said, firefighting, right? On the other hand, if you look at like mid-sized companies, this is really an interesting sweet spot for TPMs. And I think this is where companies, they have a little bit more security in their roadmap and their longevity and their confidence in existing beyond 3 months, right? I think at this point, a lot of companies, they start to see that they need a function like a TPM function to help them scale the way they execute strategic initiatives. And so at that point, I think a fractional TPM is not an IC TPM where they bring somebody in and they say, go execute on this initiative. I think at that point, you would start to see more fractional TPM leaders, kind of like a fractional CFO, right? And helps mature this domain that the company may not be as familiar with. And so this fractional TPM leader essentially helps accelerate that maturity and helps establish it a lot faster. And they don't need to be around for every single initiative throughout the week, but they need to be available to help consult and to train and to really like evangelize across the company what it is that the TPM function and culture adds to what value they add to the overall mission of the company. So I think startups and mid-sized companies look very, very different when it comes to fractional TPMs. And then big companies, I don't see much investment unless there's like a hyper specialized domain where they just can't find the talent, right? Either internally or in a full-time employee. It would surprise me if large companies, if we go back to like the size of Google, it'd surprise me if they hired something like a fractional TPM for a job. They might hire contractors for short-lived programs and projects, but that would probably be a full-time TPM for a limited number of months or weeks, but not like a fractional TPM coming in half of the week or 8 hours split throughout the 5 days, whatever it might look like. So I think that to me is a helpful context to look at fractional TPMing is through the size of the company and what the needs are and how they may react to a fractional TPM being involved.
Yeah, interesting.
What's also quite interesting when you think about, let's boil it down also to specific examples on all of that. And when you think about certain situations where TPM operating, and what clearly came to my mind at the beginning, talking about fraction, is like launching a new product, because this can be very encapsulated. This is like, there's a specific product where people are anyway like isolated and they're working on that. And this could help like making a demand for a fractional TPM, and they can be working like fully autonomously and also build the relationship for a short amount of time. And another thing, also speaking from experience, is this post-merger integration, because sometimes what is happening when you do like acquisitions or mergers, then there's always this balance between a bigger company versus smaller company or like same size merger. Then one company does have TPMs, the other ones don't. And then you can work as fraction TPM, and it's based on helping integrating it, where you can also bring technical expertise into that place. And the third one would as well be scaling a new technology, because I think out there, what we have seen in many TPMs, certain TPMs are very specialized on a certain thing that a new company wants to adopt, but they don't know where to start.
Yeah.
And this could help that specialized TPMs, and Doran, we had this on a certain podcast as well, that could like find their niche in working fractional. So I'm this opportunity thinking of where fractional could work. It could be an experiment upcoming in the next 1.5, 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. One thing you mentioned, James, was, that I took from what you said, was the tactical versus strategic sort of TPMing, right? So when you talk about I guess I'll call it the initial phase of a startup where maybe you got one round of funding, and then basically it's all sort of in firefighting mode, as you said, Michael, to kind of, for the engineers to kind of get to the point they need to get to get the funding, and then get to the next step. And then at that point there, which is the second phase, I guess, maybe, funding, maybe in that case to bring a TPM to kind of clean up the debt, clean up the mess, kind of restructure or strategically align what needs to be done, to get everything towards the next phase, the next goal they want to get to as well. So I think that sort of intermediary startup phase is where TPMs can certainly succeed. And companies think of TPMs at the beginning of when they're first created. It's usually just the engineers, product manager, or a founder is being the product manager, and things like that, which is interesting. On the other side, James, you mentioned about larger companies like Google and such. Yeah, I mean, they use contractors right now. I'm not quite convinced that will always be the case. I think with where we're at now, it's a struggle for many companies to get headcounts, with AI and all of this and that. So I think a lot of companies are defaulting to using contractors. I think that mindset may change. When you also think about fractional TPMing, they don't necessarily have to be at different companies. They could be within different orgs within the same company. And maybe there's an agency or some sort of coordination agent that can help sort of do that. And, I mean, TPMs generally by nature, what portfolios of projects. So we kind of context switch, but, what about switching between orgs or, different pillars or verticals, I guess, in that way as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, like when you've got hundreds, if not in the low thousands for these like really, really large companies of TPMs, there are probably many like fractional TPMs that are full-time employees, but they're fractional within the company itself across the orgs, which is probably the more common, but we don't traditionally think of it like a we wouldn't label that as a fractional TPM, but that could be a definition for what they experience at that scale.
Yeah, I was going to give a funny example of, I mean, this happened more during COVID, but I guess, I don't know if you guys read the news a couple of months ago. There was this guy in the Bay Area who was like basically working for like 5 or 6 companies at the same time without letting them know, sort of moonlighting across all of that. So kind of being fractional. I don't know how it was informal, obviously, and kind of not legal or ethical, but
yeah, there's, I think we all heard of at least one case of that happening, which I would hope that is not the common method to not be transparent with people you are supporting, with companies you're supporting.
Yeah, it doesn't help us in our case if you want to work from home, I guess, and building trust when people can kind of do that. So, which is interesting. So, yeah, going back to, I guess, one of the skill sets, Michael, you talked about, so the earning trust and all of that, and being there for a partial period of time. The challenge with doing that. I guess the flip side of that, do you see TPMs who work in this sort of fractional way? Are they able to build trust in a more rapid pace? Are they able to be more to kind of adapt to the situation? And we should make them sort of build an interesting skill set in the future if they ever decide to go back to full time, and or how they work with stakeholders.
I think when coming back to what we discussed before and on this, like a CFO comes in with an executive mandate to do something. But I think in that one as well, on the skill set, I think what every TPM out there, like who is listening to that, should also work on is this, the relationship building and the trust building. This is one advice that we should give every TPM. And I mean, we should not give advices, but I think many things are possible by being a good connector or being a good relationship builder, and trust, because I think those are the baselines for influencing without authority to have an influence on the roadmap, on have an influence on program scope, and having an influence on strategy as well. And the more you double down on that skill, the more I think you can survive or have success as a fraction TPM, because the faster you can build trust, the faster you can build relationship, the more you can have success in that fractional role. Which also, for a CFO, you have clear metrics. And I think one challenge for a fraction TPM might be, how is your impact measured, or how are your outcomes measured? And this is, I think, the chain of thought where you could like trust, relationship, influence, program steering, fractional TPM success in having good outcomes, depending on what you're hired for.
Yeah, interesting. I was trying to think of some other challenges, one of them being time boxing work, right? So, I mean, hopefully, if you're new to this sort of space, you'd probably start off with maybe, 1 and then 2 companies or 2 sort of fractional domains you're working on. And then how do you set clear boundaries, time box your work? What are the expectations you set for the company, for the organization? Make sure you kind of set those, those clear expectations. So what do you guys think about, some of the challenges around that, and what advice would you probably give?
I think it's really hard to time box being a TPM. Throughout an entire week, it's a very dynamic experience. Now, if you're the type of TPM that mostly just falls back on reporting what's happening, and you're that kind of channel, that's not as much of an issue. But really, like, high impact TPMs are in the trenches with engineering and product, and really like connected to what's happening on a daily basis. I haven't seen a fractional TPM myself, but I would imagine that there would have to be some daily interaction, or at least weekly, right, for a fractional TPM to hope to have impact and be successful. Because, Michael, what you've already mentioned is like the trust aspect. The time boxing is one thing. I think building relationships is probably the biggest challenge to a fractional TPM idea, like if you were to pursue that. Because this time boxing, like, relationships can't exactly be time boxed very easily. And so, you mentioned the word trust, and I think about, there's a book called The Speed of Trust by, I think, Stephen Covey. I might be wrong there. And it talks about how trust is 2 things. It's a display of competence and character. And those 2 things enable people to have those feelings of trust. So when it comes to a fractional TPM, displaying competence in these like time box windows is like, you really have to be on your game. You really have to be able to demonstrate that and communicate it really, really well as the character of being responsive and being true to your word, following up on the things that you said you were going to follow up on. And so to me, like, time boxing and relationships are really tightly coupled there when it comes to a fractional TPM experience.
One second point to that is also, I think, the things that you're working on. And one thing why potentially project management, specifically in the service and delivery landscape, when you have already an existing product, is successful, because you build your consultancy or your fractional project management or services world on top of it, is you work on something that is already known to the public. I do a bad guessing, but I would guess like greater than 70% of the TPMs are working on products that are not launched yet. And let's assume you have a fraction TPM that is working for 3 companies and you gather a lot of insight. So for a fraction TPM, it's nice because you literally don't only know not one organization, but 2 and 3 organizations where you can connect the dots on top of it. And you're not allowed to talk about it for sure, but you start like what your mind sees is starting to connect it. And if you're like a TPM, you might struggle in starting to differentiate between your time that you're allocating to certain companies. And this means then, are you hired as a fractional TPM for a short time, for 2 months or 3 months for one company, or do you serve multiple companies? I mean, not in the aggressive side that the software engineer did to work for many, in the dark, but in a steady state, like you see a lot of intellectual property, and this might get a little bit tricky, I think, and hesitation within organizations that we don't see that many fraction TPMs at the moment.
Yeah, if I were CEO of software company ABC and I had a bucket of strategically important IP confidential or like sensitive projects, and then I had another bucket of like kind of IT related projects. We need to move from this HR system to this one. We need to implement this kind of security or compliance control. I would be very hesitant to take a fractional TPM and put them in that first bucket of the IP sensitive and strategically important things, and be much more prone to say the other bucket over here is not as company unique or sensitive. Therefore, I can trust that somebody who's going to come and go quickly will be a safe bet. It's low risk.
Yeah. That's probably at least,
point,
at least probably in the start. Yeah, the start, that's probably going to be the case, I'd say. They have to kind of build confidence in this whole new paradigm of working as well, for sure. But yeah, intellectual property is another thing I was going to bring up as well. So yeah, do you see this as a barrier, I guess, comparing? So if you're a contractor, it's probably been a similar situation where you may not want to give everything fully disclosed as well, because there are temporary workers as well. So yeah, that might be another sort of barrier with that, I'd say. Yeah, I mean, conflict of interest is probably another one I was thinking of, right? You could be working at different companies, and they could be competing companies, or they could be something where there's you being in 2 places and working there might pose a conflict.
Yeah, being a fractional TPM for OpenAI while also being a TPM for Google's Gemini team probably is a no-go. That's just something they would not hire on that fractional TPM.
I wouldn't mind being a fractional TPM in Meta if in their AI sort of, if that's what they're paying. Even taking a fraction of that for me would be good.
Yeah, that would be pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, speaking of getting paid, I mean, let's assume then that this does gain more momentum. From a TPM's perspective, do you think this would be a lucrative proposition, both financially as well as career investment, or do you see this as kind of like not really being that?
Michael, I'll let you jump in there first.
Yeah, I think it should be equally paid on what would everyone earn. I want to bring a different flavor to it because, as many might know, I'm originally from Germany, and in Europe, like you have, I think Netherlands has the biggest percentage of people who work part-time, and also Germany is high rate. US is much lower compared to that. And if you blend that, then part-time workers also like have the equal salary pay. And I see the similarity there to also like fractional TPMs. I think you could have your hourly rates, and the challenge on it's hard to draw a number because similar to when you offer consulting services, you can potentially earn way more. Then this boils back to the question: what is your specialty? What is the problem of the company that you as a fractional TPM could solve? And I see it also potentially as an option when people are working part-time or want to work part-time for certain circumstances or want to take a step back or coming back from something and so forth. It could be an opportunity to also have what you call a fraction of this piece, what I equal TPM works on it. I see that you can at least like needs to get the equal what you do, but many are very secretive on what people are earning. But I would go equal on that. And then it's also hard that if you call up an hourly rate, are you going into a competition with other fractional TPMs? So you have this bidding that you have for consultancy services where, spending then more time of your fractional TPM services that you want to offer on programs by competing then into RFPs or like contract negotiations. I think there's also a downside to that when negotiating to it. So if you could go equal would be good, but you also go a higher risk potentially. So you might charge a little bit more than someone would earn on average as a TPM.
Yeah, I think the challenges for the last few years, we've seen companies have this RTO sort of push, right? We had the sort of period of time where everyone's working remotely during COVID and things like that, and now it's sort of gone backwards where people are expecting to be back in the company 3 days a week, 5 days a week, and all that. And so when you look at sort of the part-time TPMs, by nature, those folks they're not expected to come to the office. You're not going to go 1 day a week to this company, another day a week to that company. Most likely you'll be fully remote. And if you're in that space, I see this as also being a very highly competitive space where you're going to compete with folks across the country, like you're work remotely across the world, right? So you might be folks in Southeast Asia and places like that. And so it might be a race to the bottom as far as dollars and salaries. If you talk about non-critical or non-intellectual, high intellectual property stuff, then that's probably something someone can do remotely and maybe in a different continent. So that poses a challenge as well, I guess, to the viability of fractional TPMing, I think.
Yeah.
A wild idea could be you offer a subscription service. So let's say like so like I don't know, like if there's a website out there, you go there and you say like, I'm Michi and I'm putting 40 hours in there and people can subscribe to me. And
That'd be great.
It gives you a monthly retainer, and similar to what you do in coaching, that you can book coaching hours or you can do that. So people know what they're getting and they book you, and they can also do that on a subscription base, like, like Zipcar or what you can order on Amazon and all those kind of things. It would be a very like transparent concept of offering fractional TPM services.
Actually, I don't think you're way off. I mean, I've read roles where they do that. It's not actually per hour. It actually you buy like 8 hours a month or 15 hours a month. It's a high rate, but do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a friend. He's a software engineer working in the healthcare space who has that kind of model where he's got a few companies he's a fractional engineer for, and they basically bill for a tier, right? And it's working well. I think TPMs, though, have to be really cautious about the financial viability of it. The skills of a TPM, just if you're trying to sell yourself as a fractional TPM to drive programs, that's a lot of people have that skill in the TPM world. And so I don't know if there's enough value add to say, let's take the risk of having this person be a fractional TPM as well. I think it comes down to like being very, very specific in your domain of expertise. And so even at that point, though, I don't know if somebody was an AI expert, like being able to stand up AI systems, models, getting them trained, getting them deployed with features. I don't think that person necessarily markets themselves as a TPM either, because they have this domain expertise. I think the highest chance of fractional TPM being lucrative, going back to your question, is looking at those mid-sized organizations and saying, I have the leadership skills, the management skills to start this practice and to scale it quickly and have an impact quickly. I think that's probably the most feasible, financially viable route for a fractional TPM experience is that fractional TPM leader, in fact, and not so much the IC TPM route. I'm not quite convinced that that has a long runway for anybody. I just haven't seen it that much.
Yeah. What about coming in a sort of consulting approach, mentoring, right? So you might have engineering managers or project managers or someone else. And basically for you, you're building out the processes, saying, okay, this is a good way, sort of build out the process structure, Jira, this, that, flows, mentor, junior PM, and this will probably be a short, sort of defined period of time, not necessarily like perpetuity, but maybe for like a month or 2 months or something like that, it's temporary sort of consultant. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Junior is difficult. I mean, I don't want to like destroy dreams, but I believe you need to be more or less a seasoned TPM to do fractional. Because you bring certain expertise, methodologies, frameworks to ramp up very quickly into that. And if your onboarding time is consuming the bill of the customer, which is your company you TPMing then for, it might be very hard to testify your outcomes and your metrics at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. I mean, it may not be as tangible as an engineer where you can kind of evaluate the outcome and say, this does this, this does that. You sort of work in the shadows as the sort of dark art of being a TPM in that sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. Do you guys have any other thoughts, final parting thoughts on this space? Maybe you might revisit this in a year or a couple of years and see where it is, but I don't know. Any parting thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, my clear call to action. So we have theoretically soft around a lot today. And I think we have a clear picture on what it could be, what it should be, what it not be. If there are fractional TPMs out there, I think like every one of us three would agree to invite one of them back to this podcast and talk real use cases. I would be very interested into this.
Yeah, definitely. I had somebody reach out after the blog post that I posted out a few months ago, and they were trying to get into the space, and I think they were negotiating with a company, and ended up not working for salary reasons. Or I guess so. There's a misalignment on expectations of what the value is. But yes, if the folks that are successfully on this route and path, please come on the show. We'd love to sort of dive in and see how it works for you, and provide some tips and advice for everyone else.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah. James, any parting thoughts from you?
Nothing out of the ordinary from what we've already talked about. I think my thoughts on the topic are summarized by just saying, like, I see TPM work as fractional TPMs would be really, really hard, in my opinion. TPM leadership and establishing the practice is the thing to aim for if I think somebody's interested in fractional TPMing. I think anything outside of that is a really big uphill battle, or you're just smarter than me and you found a better way to do it. So that is 100% feasible.
Yeah. So don't be like that guy though who's sort of moonlighting for 5 or 6 companies though. So that's not.
Don't be that guy.
All right, folks. Well, thank you very much. And welcome back to our series now. So looking forward to our monthly series again. And back to work, I guess, for all of us, from our summer break. And, hopefully we'll see each other very soon and with a new and exciting topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Doran.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.